Hello, I'm Blaze, and welcome back to Warframe. For quite some time, a puncture-based glaive has been hinted at, teased, and had concept art shown for, but it is at this point that we finally have it at our disposal, with some unexpected quirks. And here I will be throwing out my thoughts on the Cerata. Before I continue, however, I will quickly plug something. Xenogelion and MDR Laws invited me to their 10 o'clock podcast, and the video is live now. It is also relevant to this video as it so happens because the topic of Glaives comes up as well. And besides, they're cool guys and they could use some love and it was a fun time. Go check them out. Moving along, the Cerata is the newest entry into the Tenno's throwable melee weapon arsenal and comes along with some infested themings. It is available for research at your local clan dojo's biolab, where the blueprint can be purchased for 50,000 credits, and the crafting and foundry afterwards will require a further 30,000 credits, as well as 4 mutagen masses, 2,500 cryotic, 1,200 plastids, and 1 fully built forma with a mastery rank requirement of 3. On the other hand, if you'd rather skip that, you can instead pick it up from the market, pre-built, along with its own weapon slot and a pre-installed catalyst for 150 platinum. The Cerata has a few interesting quirks in its stats compared to other weapons in its class. Starting off, it has 35 base damage when used for melee attacks, which is the equivalent to every other throwing weapon other than the Kestrel, but it sets itself apart by being pure toxin damage. This is great to bypass shielding, and is one of the 2 universally useful elements as it can also combine into viral for Grineer or corrosive for infested or void missions. Supplementing that, it has an attack rate of 1.0, which is actually tied with the default glaive for slowest in the class, but it also boasts a 15% status chance, which is tied for the highest with the Halakar, and a 15% critical chance with a 2.0 times critical damage multiplier, which in the throwing weapon class is unprecedented. It exhibits some different properties when thrown, however. Its actual total damage when thrown is 150, even though the arsenal says its thrown damage is only 105. This is a user interface bug that affects all thrown weapons, and this has been confirmed by DE Rebecca after being asked by Rob, along with the fact that when thrown, this is split between 80% puncture damage, 10% slash damage, and 10% impact damage, or 120 puncture with 15 slash and impact. So it turns out we do indeed have our puncture glaive. Not only that, but the Cerata's status chance is elevated to 25% when thrown, which is more convincing, at least on the surface. As for polarities, it comes along with a V polarity and a D polarity. The G polarity kind of sucks, but at least it isn't in the first slot. It also has a dash polarity in its stance slot, matching both Gleaming Talon and Astral Twilight. Personally, I feel the most interesting side of these stats are the respective status chances combined with the melee attack elemental damage. While 15% isn't usually that high, for an elemental weapon it helps narrow the possibilities down so that when you do get a status proc, it's going to be something that you actually want rather than one of the much less useful physical procs. Unfortunately, while thrown attacks do instead have a 25% base status chance, it is spread over the 3 physical damage types, so you'll mostly be seeing puncture procs unhitched with the throw instead. This kind of feels like a wasted opportunity. On the other side of the coin, we have the highest critical stats of the thrown weapon category. It has been called Berserker viable, but after actually trying out a critical hit Berserker build, I wasn't entirely convinced. It can work, yes, and I did test it out against high-level enemies, and a crit build worked much better there, but in actual practice, with a mere 15% base critical chance, I still went through noticeable periods where Berserker wasn't triggering, and that attack speed is actually quite slow for this weapon class, so it got painful in short order. As for its actual behaviour when thrown, I have heard discussion that the Cerata can actually bounce between enemies to damage a group, so I decided to test it out. Indeed, the Cerata can bounce between enemies and it is pretty cool when it happens. However, both the Glaive and Glaive Prime also exhibited this behaviour, so as cool as it is when it happens, it isn't unique to the Cerata. Also note that I say when it happens. I say this because it's not reliable in the slightest. Usually what happens is instead the weapon goes straight through, or sometimes even bounces off in a direction that isn't really useful to anybody. But sure enough, the amazing pinball of death effect can happen occasionally, and it's pretty entertaining when it does. I just really wish it happened more reliably. It would greatly benefit the entire weapon class. When modding the Cerata, you kind of have 2 choices. Do you want to go with the crit Berserker build that just about works thanks to the multi-hit stance combos, or do you want to maintain its utility when thrown? In either case, I definitely recommend Life Strike, which is basically essential for any melee weapon for health restore utility. I also like to go with a single dual status elemental mod to bump up its status chance. Normally, a 15% status chance isn't that great, but it can work out thanks to the fast attack rate and elemental damage. For a crit build, you basically do the same thing as any other crit weapon. Including Berserker, Organ Shatter, and True Steel tends to greatly limit your other mod choices to a single elemental combo. On the other hand, if you want to use the throwing weapons as an actual throwing weapon, your options open up somewhat, but it will underperform at close range compared to a crit build. I personally value the greatly increased flight speed and subsequently increased effective range that is granted with Whirlwind. The last slots can then be used for an elemental mod or one of the other utility mods. Power Throw to cause the Cerata to explode at the end of its flight as well as the manual channel trigger. Quick Return to limit it to one strike, or Rebound in cases where you want it to bounce around more in an attempt to spread out the pain. I usually use Spoiled Strike on most weapons to take advantage of the base damage increase, but the Cerata has enough problems all on its own with being slow even without Spoiled Strike's attack speed penalty, so for once it stays out of the build. Personally, I'm not really feeling the Cerata. It has brought thrown melee weapons in a somewhat new direction, and to its credit, it is making me reconsider my assessment of other weapons in the class, since it does seem I was using them wrong. I tended to just use the throw attacks all the time, which is its own problem due to how slow throwing them is. But the Cerata itself, while it does have the benefit of an elemental damage type, becomes frustrating at high levels. Its default speed makes a basic elemental build rather painful, and while a critical focus build that uses Berserker can work, it's much too inconsistent for my liking. The thing with Berserker is that you need to get critical hits to keep your attack speed up. It's not like guns where the critical hits are just bonus damage, and where a 15% critical chance can sometimes be good enough. On melee weapons, they end up becoming somewhat intrinsic to how the weapon handles. And if you aren't getting critical hits with the weapon, it is as a result comparatively much slower. For some reference, I've had problems with the Berserker running out even on melee weapons with a 20% critical chance like the Sindo Prime. So multi-hit combos or not, a 15% critical chance suffers pretty significantly. And the sad thing is, when you build the Cerata for crits, you're kind of also building it with no support for thrown attacks, which is basically supposed to be this class's whole selling point. Easily the best part about the Cerata is its toxin-based melee attacks, which is good for elemental combos and making that normally forgettable 15% status chance do some good work. But overall, the Cerata leaves me feeling pretty lukewarm. If you happen to be really into this weapon class, then perhaps unlike me you will find considerable value here. Due to the recent vaulting of the Glaive Prime, this might even be the best you can get if you only recently started playing. But as for myself, the Cerata is going back to the arsenal to collect dust. Thank you for watching my look at the Cerata. All comments are appreciated, and I hope to see you around next time. For more content, you can give a click down below to go to my recent look at the new Atlas Warframe or the Sonic Core. And if you haven't checked it out yet, go watch episode 108 of the 10 o'clock podcast already. And as always, good luck, have fun, and take care.